That start, it's hard to compete. Talking after that is not easy. But I'd like to start out by saying that as an historian, if one looks at the narrative of the history of the Revolution of Mexico of 1910, for a long time, up until about 20 or 25 years ago, it really was very empty of women. Now, everybody knew that women had been a very important part of this movement. The public knew through corridos and through films that there had been soldaderas. I don't know how many of you here have the pleasure, the joy maybe of seeing Maria Felix as Juana Gallo, La Generala, all these incredible films that were made showing the brave, brave warrior women of the revolution called soldaderas. And that image is one that remains even today. The soldadera as a warrior woman, the soldadera as a participant in the revolution. But it leaves out so much. For example, that picture is one of the most famous pictures that one sees of the Mexican Revolution. And I don't know that we see any women there at all.
Nope.
Right? So this narrative which was flowing there and that was creating, as Carlos Monsiváis said, a collective imaginary of women with the cross belts of ammunition. Maybe show that other next one. And then with the cross belts of ammunition and women fighting, that gave this sense of women being like men, being masculinized if they participated in the revolution. This is something that's been brought up by several scholars. As a matter of fact, John Womack, one of the best known researchers and writers and knowledgeable people of the revolution, speaks about how one of the things the revolution left behind, or one of the things that it accomplished as kind of collateral damage maybe, was the growing of machismo, or the refocusing of machismo in Mexico and in Mexican culture. Carlos Monsiváis also speaks of how when we think of the Mexican Revolution, we think of it very much as something carried out by men. But what happens when we look at the pictures of Casasola? It is filled, his collection of photographs are filled with photographs of women who were there, not as generalas, not fighting, but as what later became called las Juanas. And we have some corridos that speak of las Juanas. These were the women who took off or were carried off by soldiers. Women who followed their soldier, who cooked for them, who foraged food for them, who gathered firewood, who made sure they had a place to sleep, and who had probably, well yes, had sex with them as well. They went with their man. Sometimes, as I say, they were stolen from their homes. So here we have thousands of women following thousands of soldiers who rarely fired a gun or a rifle, but were there to keep the army alive, so to speak. And they were the ones who traveled on the roofs of trains while the horses were put inside the train, the livestock cars that they had. So this great contribution has also been found in photographs and in corridos. But the story isn't just simply who was in the army and who was fighting. There were women who participated in all other levels as well. There were business women, there were teachers, there were nurses that also wanted and had a vision of a better world. And I want you to stop to think just for a moment. What is a revolution when it starts? It's having a vision for something better. And there were a number of women in Mexico who had a vision of something better. And that something better was something called equality, equality with men, who wanted to participate politically, participate intellectually, participate economically. And these were not new ideas that started in 1910. Just like the ideas of a number of men for a better world did not start in 1910. But they had a time that they were planted and had grown. And I find as we look into the 19th century, there were working class women. For example, in 1876, women were in the textile factories of Oaxaca and Veracruz, in the DF, in Jalisco, and the bosses were all men. And unions were started, and the union leaders were all men, but it was mostly women who worked at the looms. And some way or other, and there are different stories, John Hart, the historian, tells of different ways, but it appears that some of these anarchist ideas from Spain had crept in to some of the unions. Women learned about equality from anarchist ideas. We've heard of that here in this country as well in the 19th century. So working class women were organizing and calling for equality and for better wages and better working conditions. At the same time, and this goes back to the 1840s, there were already strong indications that a number of women in Mexico who had been educated, and there were more and more as time went on. The Porfiriato was a great believer in educating women because they needed a larger workforce. The industrialization that he sought, the progress for Mexico needed workers. And today we see Mexico as having an abundance of workers, but that was not true in the 19th century. Do you realize that it was not until 1960 that Mexico had the number of population, the number of people in it that it had in 1521. So the Porfiriato was known for holding on to workers. Forced labor was one way, because it was very important to have them. And it was very important to educate women enough so that they could enter the workforce. So we have a number of women who could read and write, who became teachers, who were pounding on the doors of institutions of higher learning, who had connected with the women's movement in other parts of Europe and the United States. And they too were calling for equality, were calling for the vote, were calling for daycare centers for their children, were calling for an end to child labor. They had a vision for a better world as well.